German car makers built their success in Europe and found a growth engine in China. But that model is breaking apart. In Europe, weak demand and high costs are piling on the pressure. Volkswagen alone is cutting 100,000 jobs globally and closing factories in Germany. Meanwhile, Germany's car makers have seen a collapse in market share in China, once a cornerstone of their growth plans. They could go to the US. Mercedes and BMW are investing billions into ramping up their presence there. Is it time for German car companies to abandon China, even turn their focus away from Europe? Is it time for Germany to accept the industry's managed decline? Welcome to The Dip, your podcast for money, power, and consequences. I'm Daniel. And I'm happy to be joined now by Anna-Marie Baisden, who has led coverage of the automotive industry at research firm BMI since 2005, tracking where global car makers sell, build, and invest. Anna-Marie, thank you very much for taking the time for us today. I want to ask you a kind of personal question first. So if you were to go out today and buy a brand new car, are you just automatically going to buy European, or are you now starting to look at China and Chinese vehicles?
It's a good question. We were actually recently considering a new car, and honestly, I don't think we would rule out Chinese brands. We were recently at Goodwood Festival of Speed. A lot of Chinese presence there. They were unveiling some of their new models, and it's clear that they're bringing a lot of value for money. And so, yeah, I certainly wouldn't rule it out.
So let's get in kind of at the ground floor here and talk about the German car industry first and the difficulties that it's had. So can you kind of lay out in simple terms, what is the state of the German car industry at the moment? That is, German brands as they operate globally.
Yeah, of course. They're facing so many different challenges, really. Here in Europe, sales still haven't got back to pre-pandemic levels, and that means that apart from the financial impact of that, a lot of them are also facing overcapacity issues. We've seen Volkswagen talking about large numbers of redundancies and early retirements as much as possible to cut down their numbers, floated the idea of closures, although there was some pushback on that. So they're dealing with this overcapacity issue. And then you've got China, which is the biggest standalone market for a lot of these brands, where things have completely flipped for them in the last 10 years or so, where you would have a brand like Volkswagen that led the market with one of its local partners. And now its sales have pretty much halved since 2019. And now the Chinese brands are just dominating that market, and it's very difficult for any foreign brands, let alone German ones. So they're facing all of these issues. They're also, the whole electrification push. A lot of them put billions of euros into this, and now it's not playing out as intended. So a lot of companies are revisiting those plans. So, they're just dealing with so many things all at once.
And is there any sort of any light there, any positive, any upside for Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, all of these car companies at the moment? Do you see anywhere where they can cling on to some hope?
Well, certainly we saw in the earnings results that came out recently for the first half of the year and the second quarter. Europe actually proved to be a bright spot for them. And a lot of that, having just talked about electrification not playing out as expected, a lot of that did actually come from the electrified market. So you had pure battery electric vehicle sales were up by about 40% in Europe, plug-in hybrids up by around 22%, and they were really able to capitalize on that. So that was actually one of the bright spots. Whereas before, China had been one of their big growth engines. So that proved to be positive. And while we're talking about electrification, even a market like the US, where federal tax breaks were withdrawn in September last year, hybrid demand has really been growing. And so for those car makers, and a lot of them are European, that already have hybrids in the portfolio, or they've changed their strategy to add more hybrids, they're in a really good position to take advantage of that. And again, in recent results, BMW saw its plug-in hybrid sales in the US rise by about 30% last year. So that's a real area of opportunity for them as well.
Yeah, and we'll dig into that a bit further as we go. Let's start with China then. What has been the big issue that German car makers have faced in China? Because for a while it was a cornerstone of their growth, and they seem to be doing fantastically well. And then something flipped, whether it was slowly or all of a sudden, it feels quite sudden. What went wrong for them in China?
I don't know if it's a case of what went wrong for them or what went right for the Chinese brands,
Right,
in
yeah.
terms of they got a lot of support from the government. We hear this talked about a lot in Europe because now these Chinese brands are coming and taking a real foothold in Europe as well. But they had a lot of this government support across the whole supply chain. You know, if you look at EVs, for example, it's not just producing the cars, they also dominate a lot of the supply chain, right from the minerals and metals processing for the batteries. And so that, as well, the fact that China has moved so quickly towards electric vehicles, that was a real push for them. And now, understandably, with a lot of brand loyalty from the Chinese consumers as well, and the incentives for buying Chinese brands, we've just seen these Chinese brands dominate. And now you would have to say they're further advanced in terms of things like battery electric vehicles, software defined vehicles. And now it almost feels like that relationship's flipped. Whereas, when VW came in and was partnered with a local partner for knowledge sharing, it's almost going the other way now. We see European brands trying to learn from what those Chinese brands are doing. BMW's partnered with the likes of Huawei and to get more into the tech side and to develop that side. There's really been a flip of who's learning about the market.
Yeah, it's a fascinating change. And I think
Mhm.
we can think about China in two kinds of ways for these German companies. One is building in China for China, and the other is building in China for export to third markets. So if we just focus on the in China for China aspect of that, should they just essentially give up on that now? Is the race won and the Chinese firms have simply pulled ahead? Should they consider pulling out of the Chinese market altogether, these German companies?
I think that would be a real last resort for them because even though, I talked about how far VW sales have fallen, it's still their largest standalone market. It's still one of their big profit drivers. And I think because they've been there for so long and they've seen what the potential can be if they get it right, they don't necessarily want to lose that. And if anything, we're seeing them doubling down. So you talked about made in China for China. This is becoming a real strategy, focusing on localization, and not just, we're going to use more local supply chain and that kind of thing, but also we're making these models for the Chinese market, for the Chinese consumer. Um, and really trying to implement what they've learned from seeing more of these local models. Um, and so that really seems to underline the fact that they want to be there because it helps them learn more about the market and to
Mm.
try and see what can help them be more competitive. So I think it would be unlikely that we would see them just pull out altogether.
But a cynic would say that the market there is kind of stacked against them, and that we've seen the
Mhm.
direction that it's going in now, and that China is helping its homegrown companies to do well, and they are doing well. It's not simply fakery. They are actually developing products which people want to buy at a high quality level, and that's the most important thing. That's why you said the German companies are now learning from the Chinese companies. But what do you think their future prospects are in China if we look at the state of play and also just how involved the Chinese government is there at helping that homegrown talent?
It's certainly going to be a struggle, but I wouldn't say by any means they can't do it. I think, Volkswagen's already seeing relative success with one of its locally produce models. Audi's seen the same with its new sub brand. It released a whole new brand specifically for China. So I think they are starting to make headway. Whether they can see the same kind of success as the Chinese brands and the same kind of success they saw before, that's maybe a different matter. Because also you have to look at what's going on in the market as a whole, which is sales are slowing down from the pace of growth we've seen previously in China. So that's something that's going to impact everyone. But there are signs that if they can really tap into what is successful for the local brands, then there's certainly opportunities.
Okay, so perhaps some potential still to come in China for the German companies, or at least they've still got hope in it. But turning our
Yeah.
attention to the US now, BMW has
Mm.
put $1.7 billion into a South Carolina expansion. Mercedes has announced $7 billion in the US that they're going to invest there by 2030. What does this tell you about the forces that are um, putting pressure on German car makers in terms of where they decide that they want to expand and build?
Yeah, there's certainly a big policy aspect to this. The US tariffs on imported vehicles have certainly made car makers have to stop and think about how they'll continue doing business with the US.
Great. Can
And
I
for the
just jump
German,
on that first? So are we saying
yeah.
that a big part of their US sales could be made up by sending cars from the EU that they made in the EU to the US, and now they're going to cut that or cut it more in favor of building in the US? Is that how that shakes out?
Well, we started looking at this when the tariffs were implemented. If you look at Porsche, it has smaller volumes than the others, so it may not necessarily be in their interests to start producing in the US. But certainly, those brands that already do produce in the US, they're expanding those facilities or adding to them. Um, and really, it's because those facilities in the US are not just for the US. Some of them are actually global export bases for certain models, particularly the big premium SUVs, which sell well in the US, but they also export them. Um, so there is a business case there for investing in the US, but we would say maybe they've been nudged a little by the policy that's been put in place.
Okay, and is there something about the conditions in the US market itself which makes it more attractive, or certainly more attractive at the moment than the difficulties that they're having in the Chinese market?
Yes, and I think, talking about the fact that they're building premium SUVs, there were always very different kinds of passenger markets, whereas you had, well, particularly for the mass market manufacturers, North America is very much light trucks and big SUVs, whereas if you go 10 years ago back to in Europe, it's more hatchbacks, little city cars. If you were a European mass market brand producing those kinds of cars, they didn't sell as well in the US. But now we've seen this almost global consumer shift towards SUVs, and that has really helped because it means, as well as the premium cars that were already selling well for the likes of BMW and Mercedes, they've always been status symbols in the US. Now they can add these kind of bigger volume models as well, like the SUVs. So the product mix is a lot more favorable for them to be in the US as well at the moment.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you and your team at BMI have done a lot of work looking into regionalization in car makers. And can you explain what it means when we just talk about regionalization and how it is shaping the future of the car industry?
Yeah, so this is when we talk about localization of the supply chain. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So what we've seen, and to be honest, this is not just around tariffs. There have been so many things over the last few years that have really sparked this. And I think if we go back to COVID as well, it became clear just how reliant a lot of car makers are on Asia and particularly on China. Um, and because it was difficult, supply trains were really disrupted even when things started opening up again. And so it became clear that maybe the other big automotive markets, such as Europe, such as North America, needed more local supply chains. And so What we've seen, because as you said, we track investment into the manufacturing side of the industry region by region. And what we've seen is a lot more investment into the supply chain, into EV batteries. In some cases, that's now been scaled back in North America, particularly where EV demand isn't what it was expected to be. But certainly, we're seeing a lot more investment into localizing those supply chains so that European brands, American brands, they don't have to be as reliant on one particular region or one particular country. And so, if there are disruptions again, at least their suppliers are closer to them.
So if, let's say, factories in Germany start closing, obviously that has a massive effect on the suppliers as well. Is there any
Mm.
sense that some of this business can be picked up elsewhere so that they can move some of these trusted suppliers, and that the trusted suppliers are happy to go with Volkswagen, for example, to the US? Or is it building entirely a brand new set of supply chains and partnerships inside that new location?
It's certainly possible because we see this a lot actually with South Korean brands. They've set up mostly in southern states in the US. And what we've seen is, a little cluster of suppliers, again, the South Korean suppliers that they usually work with, setting up there with them. So it wouldn't be unheard of for that to happen, certainly.
And now, just kind of focusing in on Germany itself again. I mean, Germany produced a record 1.67 million electric cars last year, which is second only to China. So, is the crisis at the moment being overstated, would you say?
I would say not necessarily because, yes, that is impressive. It's a record number of electric vehicles. But we're also at a point at the moment where demand can still absorb that kind of production. I think this is one of the concerns is that will it start fading? I mean, I think we already saw EV sales starting to slow down a little in Europe before we had the US-Iran conflict where fuel prices rose. We saw a lot more interest in electric vehicles. Um, so there is that concern as to whether that's sustainable. And then there's also, as I, alluded to at the beginning, um, quite a bit of overcapacity in terms of, well, what about the vehicles that they're not producing anymore? There's still the capacity for those. Um, and when you look at the size of the job cuts that VW is talking about making, could be up to 100,000. So I think the concern is definitely real. But as we were saying, there are certainly some bright spots. It just depends on, I think we're kind of at a crossroads as to how this electrification journey is going to play out and whether we can keep this going now or whether it is going to be very cyclical, depending on things like geopolitical events.
So, an uncertain trajectory. But when it comes to the difficulties that these car makers are facing in Germany, is it simply down to circumstances? We've seen, for example, high electricity prices, meaning that the cost of production is high in Germany,
Yeah.
tough labor laws, all kinds of other things that the companies themselves have mentioned. Is it those circumstances, or is it more failure to plan, failure to take risks at the top levels, the executive levels of these companies, and therefore failing to get ahead of the competition?
I'd say a little bit of everything in that case. Certainly, I think we saw this with Russia Ukraine as well when energy prices rose and competitiveness really started to take a hit. We started to see how this was going to play out. Um, I don't know if the decision making necessarily has been too cautious because, as I said, we saw companies putting billions of euros into developing EVs. Maybe it was a little behind the curve, though, when you look at the Chinese industry. Um, and it's also, I mean, we hear so much about Chinese brands coming to Europe and the damage that's doing. Um, but I think the reality is it's so difficult in terms of policy to compete with what the Chinese government's done because there you can have much more centralized, agile decision making in China because it is so centralized government, whereas Germany being part of the EU, it takes a lot longer for policy to come through. You have to have all of the member states in agreement. So there's also an element of that the policy that's supportive of these big investment decisions hasn't always been there for them.
And so, what are the chances of a turnaround? Do you see that there are levers that the government can pull that will genuinely help the German car makers?
I would say there are limits to what the German government itself can do because of being an EU member state. And so a lot of the policy, the much bigger policy that will help, such as we saw after COVID, that's a good example of a lot of the supportive policy came at the EU level, because you can't subsidise national sectors as a member state. So we've seen things certainly from the national level, such as the new EV incentives that came in at the start of this year. They can do that to support the EV sales. Um, and actually, from the EU level, we're starting to see some of these supportive measures come through, like the Industrial Accelerator Act, which is meant to really focus on localization, as we were talking about earlier, and the sort of made in Europe support for using more local supply chains.
Okay.
But I would say again, that's very supportive for clean technologies. It doesn't necessarily cover the whole industry.
Yeah. And so, is there some sort of intervention that seems possible? I mean, like on a practical level, not just a theoretical level, from Brussels in order to, for example, put up tariffs to make it more difficult for China to bring models into the EU. I know, though, they're also setting up factories to actually make some of these Chinese models in the EU. In Hungary, for example, there's a lot of investment being put in there. Um, so the difficulty, though, seems to be to get the member states of the EU to actually agree on a common position. So do you even foresee any sort of pushback coming from the EU in terms of putting up tariffs, for example?
Well, VW actually alluded to this in their recent earnings call, and it does seem like an easy win in terms of adding additional support. The fact that the tariffs at the moment are on battery electric vehicles, on Chinese imported battery electric vehicles, those tariffs don't cover plug-in hybrids. And so as a result, you've now got Chinese brands accounting for around 30% of the plug-in hybrid market. Again, a segment which is doing very well in Europe at the moment because they're a little bit cheaper, not as much range anxiety. So that's been great for the Chinese brands. So if you were to consider that, expanding the tariffs to other segments of the electric vehicle market, that could be, low hanging fruit in terms of something to do to support the local industry.
Yeah, you just have to get all of these member states to agree. That seems to be the
Yeah.
the big problem, the big issue there. But if they can, then that could be a massive lever that they can pull. So, kind of bringing this into land a little bit now. Um, Do you, okay, just a spicy take, you can agree or disagree with it. Do German car companies need to be less German in order to survive? And that could mean, do they need to be more Chinese? Do they need to be more American even in order to um, move up the next rung of the ladder and be where they need to be in the near future?
It's a good question. And I think what we were saying about China earlier, the fact that they're now learning from the Chinese brands how to be competitive in that market, it could be that they learn from each market. They learn what is in demand, how they can be competitive. So yeah, it could be a fact of just learning from each of the big markets that you're in. But I think there's also something important in having that identity. That there's still a lot of store in German brands and the quality and the history and everything that goes with a lot of those brands. So I think they need to maintain that, but maybe learn from the markets that they're in.
Okay, and the question that's been put out a lot by the German media recently is whether these companies will survive. And I think from our conversation, what you're saying is in the near term, there is absolutely potential if they can learn and adapt and grow and be in the markets where they have that growth potential. So if they do survive, are they going to look like very different companies in the next few years?
Absolutely. I think they'll need to, because the industry
That is
itself is
nice.
constantly evolving. Not just the vehicles switching to electrified and software defined and everything, but even the way they build them. We're seeing a lot more technology coming into the manufacturing side. So there'll certainly be very different companies, maybe even taking on different revenue streams as well to keep them going, because we're already seeing this. You're seeing some companies looking at, should we partner with defense companies, and is there a route we can take to use some of that extra capacity that we've got? Just looking outside of the German companies for a second, Stellantis is producing models for its Chinese partner in Europe. That is another way you can use some of that capacity and actually, gain some advantage from the fact that Chinese brands want to be in Europe. So I think they will definitely be different companies just from the way they'll have to evolve really alongside the industry.
Yeah, well, and I guess one of the measures that we can put in place is whether they can tempt you to buy, instead of going to look for a Chinese model, maybe they can tempt you to buy a German model. But yeah, they've got to up their standards, perhaps. Anna-Marie, thank you very much for taking the time for us today. That was fantastic.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this week on The Dip. Thank you very much for listening. Don't forget to leave a comment or question. Any feedback is welcome wherever you're tuning in. And if you're not subscribed in the podcast app of your choice, just go ahead and do so. We are everywhere. Just look for The Dip. But until next time, thank you very much for watching The Dip.